There are lots of players in society that have power, access to resources. The question is whether the decision makers who have control over that power and those resources are really determined to use them to fix these issues. And you could think of it as being a systemic problem, that people in large organisations, whether those organisations are corporations or governments, other forms of international body, they are locked inside a system which detaches them from the impact of the decisions that they make. So individuals may be deeply concerned about fixing the kind of social issues and ecological change. Context in which they work, the relationships that allow them to make decisions and implement those decisions, don't empower them to make real change. By contrast, communities are very different from that, because people are close to the ground, they're close to the resources that they have some control or influence over, so they can affect things. And I'm not in any way trying to argue that communities can do it on their own. Governments, other forms of large body, corporate, public sector, are vital enablers of change. But we could have the best policies and regulations in place and still not see the changes that we actually need. I'll talk a little bit about my own experience of communities. So I'm from a community in northwest London, a Jewish community, and I've always found that to be very important in my life. Anyone that knows me will know that my outlook, my music, my humour has been deeply influenced by the community I grew up in. And although I left that community and moved away from London when I was in my early 20s, something of that always stays with me. And it's been very rewarding to have that community always in my life. And I've heard from other people anecdotally that they feel a lack of that. Some people feel disconnected from traditions. Other people anecdotally say that they feel too connected to a tradition, that they feel it to be constricting on them in the way they would choose to live their life. And I suppose one can look at this as in the sense that every family has its own story, and you as an individual are somewhere in that story. Shown in this little map I've got here from Google is part of my own family's story, from arriving in the Jewish East End in the 1890s through to mostly now, or many, living in the suburbs of northwest London. Shown in that little picture on the top left is my mum and dad's diamond wedding, which we had after a lovely occasion at the synagogue where everyone read a little portion. And it was funny to look at that on Google and see that the journey from Hackney to Stanmore is 45 minutes, whereas the psychogeographical journey for my family is a lot longer in that it's generational. And of course, many people in my family don't live in London anymore. But the point I'm making is that that story is a really important part of my psyche and that of everyone else in my family. And it's kind of easy for me in my generation, because I'm third generation immigrant. And people who are closer to a background that is more challenging may find their communities to be, in some sense, more constricting sometimes. They can also find them more rewarding. People who are further away from a story such as this might feel more disconnected from their family background. But if you start to see yourself as on a journey, it can do two things. For the people that feel they might be too close to the start of that journey, it can help to position them and perhaps see that their children and their children's children will find that journey different to their own. If you feel a long way from such a story in your own family, you can look back, you can do family history, and you can find in your own story a community that can be a source of importance for you. On the right-hand side, you should be able to see something of the community I live in now, which is in a village in Somerset. And when we got married, I married a non-Jewish girl, and I was worried that my children wouldn't have access to the same source of tradition that I did in my life. And my wife Anne said to me, "Don't worry, leave it to me." And it's been lovely to see how they have had every bit as rich a tradition and a sense of connection to community and a sense of connection to the seasons that I did. And that has partly been through old traditions, partly been through new traditions. You can see here the nunny duck race, which when I first moved to the village, I thought was with real ducks. Turns out it's with plastic ducks. And underneath is a ridiculous picture of one of our dogs, Snuffkin, dressed up for the Easter bonnet parade. What I learned a couple of things from that. I first learned that if your wife says, "Don't worry, leave it to me," it's a good idea to do that. But I also learned that traditions are different in every community and as rich and as rewarding in every community. And wherever you live, it's the country, it's the city, there are often seasonal traditions. And there are other events that can become important in your life and that connect you to those around you. And in that way, connect you to people that come before and come after as well. Two other communities that I've been very involved in. So I play music, I play jazz. And when we first had children, we suddenly found, as so many people do, that our social life was cut off at the knees. We couldn't go out in the evening anymore, not very easily. And I couldn't get out to play in gigs so much. So we thought, well, Anne and I thought there must be lots of people in our position that also have young children, so can't get out. Or perhaps for other reasons, don't find it easy to get out as they used to. So we started an event in our village called the Nunny Jazz Cafe, which we got together lots of friends, lots of other musicians and artists and people, not just from our local area, but people from Bristol involved in the creative and the charitable communities. And we would put on music once a month on a Sunday in the afternoon. And when we first started doing that, I didn't know how it would work. I didn't know whether jazz in the afternoon was even a thing, really. Could it work? You think of jazz as being a late night thing. And it was just a huge success. And almost immediately, people started to really relate to it and really talk about it. And we made it into the national press, we were on TV and radio, and people started saying all these things about the Nunny Jazz Cafe. And I still didn't really understand what it was that had really ignited this interest and this kind of love for the event we were putting on. And then I realised that actually we were just, in a certain way, bringing jazz home. The music that I'd always loved, I'd thought of it as being a late night thing. But when you think of how jazz musicians tell their stories, they always talk about hearing jazz played in church or hearing jazz played in the street in parades or funerals, or having people in their street play and learning from them. And if you think of the working life of a jazz musician, then often they play at night, perhaps sleep late in the morning. And then when they get up, what do they do in the afternoon? Well, they get together with other musicians and they play jazz. Some of the greatest music was made in the afternoon. In a very real sense, jazz belongs in a family environment and is often made in the afternoon. So that taught me something about the importance of mixing up the generations, the importance of bringing things home. That actually a lot of things that are very valuable in our society are come from that blend of community, intergenerational mixing. And the last part of my own community experience I wanted to highlight, because it's taught me something, is the folk music scene that I also got involved with about 10 years ago. We always went to folk sessions. We used to go to one about 30 years ago in Oxford in a pub, and that was kind of inspirational for me because I used to see these Irish musicians playing and think, how do they do it? They got their music, and they never seem to discuss where they're going to play next. They just go from one thing into the other. It's all so fast. It's so exciting and brilliant and moving. And I never for a moment thought this was music I could ever play. And it took me 30 years to realise that actually that was probably how most people think about jazz. And if you want to do something, all you have to do is learn how to do it. So I bought a little concertina, and I started learning Irish folk tunes, and eventually I got to the point where I thought I could just about face going to a session, and I went to an Irish session, and everyone was really welcoming there. I was terrible, I could barely play, but they were very welcoming. And now it's a really big part of my life. And again, I took away something very important from that, which is that if there's a community out there that you want to belong to, well, you just have to learn a bit about it. You just have to show willing and ask if you can participate. And the chances are that that will be welcomed, you'll be helped. I was helped when I first started going to the sessions, even though I was absolutely terrible. So all those community experiences have given me a great love for communities, and that's kind of paralleled by the journey I've been on in my working life. What you see here is the book that I've just written, Supercommunities. And the two people that wrote foreword kind of represent opposite ends of my own working experience. I've started out as a technical person, and Vint Cerf, who wrote one of the forewords for the book, was the Co-Inventor of the internet. And I've ended up focusing more on social issues, which is what I'm going to mainly talk about today. And it was the outcome, the book was the outcome of a lot of different experiences for me. One which was very early on in my career working on a government-sponsored research project into the nature of management, and that taught me that management is a collaborative activity. Over the years, I started to realise that people didn't really understand the processes of management. No one was trying to write them down. There wasn't even a notation for writing them down. So my first book was about that, about how to write down collaborative processes. And it took me a long time of knocking around business and government to realise that even though people could have a notation for writing down processes, mostly they didn't want to. Mostly people didn't want really to formalise collaboration, to even to make it better. Where they did want to do that, where there's a real need for doing that, is in the social sector, in the community and voluntary sector, because that's built on collaboration. And government and industry, by and large, are built on certain kinds of structured partnership, but often on forms of control. But in the community and voluntary sector, no one's truly in charge. Everyone has to work together in order to make anything happen. So their collaboration is really important. And I started working with the NHS on how to collaborate between health and social care and the community sector. And I went on to create a platform that helped communities take control and ownership of their assets in order to build wellness. And it's that that led to the Supercommunities model, this notion of ownership, which is where I started with the picture of the people in a boat, that if you want to really turn things around for your own community, you have to take ownership of the problem, and that means taking ownership of your capitals and of your assets. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what those things are. In the last 20 years, there's been a huge volume of new ideas, new research on how society can be structured for better overall wellness, let's put it that way. Ideas on how to reduce inequality, better ideas on how to manage debt, new ideas on how communities can create circular economies, how at different levels society can be more democratic. But it seemed to me there were three missing links in all that, and which is why it was hard to make it happen at anything else than a very small scale. The first link was the theory of collaboration that I mentioned before, that collaboration is often used as a buzzword, a touch point, but it's not often done well. It's not often done in a formalised, structured way that actually guarantees outcomes. My first book set 5 principles that should underpin effective collaboration: commit, communicate, contribute, calculate, and change. What I was arguing was that you have to do these 5 things in order to collaborate efficiently. Commit is about understanding the roles the different partners in a collaboration play and what their committing to achieving by playing that role. Communicate was about having purposeful communications, not just communication of information. Contribute was about acknowledging and valuing and using everything that people put into a collaboration, which might be intangible in many different ways. Calculate was about effective use of time, working towards the outcomes of the collaboration rather than just working. And change was about acknowledging changes in the environment and using that to change your plans. So that was the first missing link, collaboration. The second one was about wellness. That wellness is a holistic concept, which is much more even than physical and mental health. Even adding mental health into the picture doesn't really capture what wellness is for most people. You can't feel truly well, truly fulfilled. You can't flourish if you feel unsafe, if you can't get around, if you don't have access to the learning resources you need to improve your life. And there are many ways to break down all these holistic aspects of wellness. I use a wellness wheel of 10, which are all interconnected. But the main point is to recognize that these different aspects exist, and that in order to make them fit together in your own life, you have to create a plan. And the system that I and a couple of other people on this call are involved with in Birmingham, we called that a wellness plan, and it was based on the idea of PsyCap, or positive psychological capital, that in order to turn your life around, you needed to have hope, believe that you could turn it around, you feel some sense of self-efficacy, that you were empowered to do it, and the ability to bounce back from setbacks. That's resilience, with the understanding that setbacks were inevitable, temporary. That's optimism. Put together, that's positive psychological capital, and psychological capital depends on having a connection with your community. Some RSE research showed that. So that was the second missing link, this kind of combination of holistic wellness, which depends on a wellness plan and connection with those around you in the form of a support network. And then the final missing link was about how to fund this. I said at the beginning of this that governments, large organisations, big philanthropy can help enable change, but it's never going to be enough, and it's never going to be distributed completely fairly and evenly. So there needs to be a mechanism that's much more grassroots for funding the kind of changes that people want to see, funding the effort that people make in supporting local wellness. And you can achieve that by constructing the work that you do, whether it's to maintain assets in your community, whether it's to use those assets to help people, as social enterprises. And if you do that and you adopt an approach I call stake it back, which is to understand that those social enterprises are risky but ultimately profitable, and allow people to invest in them on that basis. So a very simple mechanism by which a social enterprise sets a target and says, if people invest in the business on reaching this target, I will return their investment plus a small amount extra. That's it. That's a stake it back mechanism. Then you can fund social enterprises with very low admin, with very low overhead, and that's key, because at community level, everything's quite small, and you can't use mechanisms that were designed for large capital markets. You have to have a new kind of mechanism, a simpler, more direct one. And that can be enabled by technology, but you can do it without technology too. So putting that all together, putting those ideas together with ideas from all these other progressive sources that I mentioned, that's the Supercommunities model. And what you see here is the separation between community capitals and community assets. So on the right-hand side, you have natural and human and industrial capitals. These are the resources that every community has. They'll be different for every community, but they will always exist. And people can collaborate either individually or between the organisations they belong to, which may be their work organisations, maybe community organisations, maybe government organisations, to improve those assets. and one is to use those assets to increase wellness. And if done in a structured way, you can create the virtuous circle that you see on the left, by which community projects are created as social enterprises that help create and maintain the community assets. So to give an example, a river might be a community capital. A river path that people use to walk and run and cycle on might be a community asset. Or a running group might be a community asset. Or a cafe where people can meet and perhaps do community meetings that are held there regularly for various purposes. That might be a community asset. And a community capital might be something like an old industrial building that on its own doesn't deliver value to the community, but when it's used to construct community assets like the cafe or like other forms of activity, space, can deliver value to individuals in the community. And then the loop goes from projects that maintain the assets through to the assets used by people to maintain their wellness. And you can measure the value of those assets by measuring how much wellness they create. And align that with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the supercommunities model in a nutshell. The enabling technology is, let's say, emerging. I built parts of it, and now I'm starting to think of the technology as being a platform rather than as being a set of apps. The reason I think it's important is because one of the things communities need to own if they're to thrive in the digital age is their data. I think everybody is becoming more aware of the way that their data is being harvested and used by large organisations, often large commercial organisations, and that data is often being used not only to understand their behaviour in ways that individuals might not wish, but also to modify that behaviour. I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think it's even sustainable for the big tech companies that have created the underpinning ability to do that. So communities need to own their data. And that platform by which they do it, that's what I think of as the Internet of Communities, and is based on the notion that the efforts that people make inside communities to increase wellness using assets, to improve their assets using capitals, those efforts, those projects, the outcomes of those projects can be captured in data stores that communities themselves own. And then you would get a way for search engines to actually tell you what was going on in a community rather than just point to a set of disconnected websites about it. You would have forms of data that people could share in a consensual way that could be used by AI tools to understand the effectiveness of community organisations and their projects, to identify gaps in service where there are overlaps between organisations that are doing the same thing. And that's a form of AI for good that is very practical and immediately achievable. And you could allow people to share in their public profiles or on a case-by-case basis what they do in their communities, with their communities that they belong to. And they could do that in order to build trust. So at the moment, when you meet someone online in a working context or a personal context, you have various ways of finding out a little bit about them. You can find out from their LinkedIn profile something about their working history, from their Facebook page, something about their life. But all that can be faked, and we are increasingly seeing bots that mimicking that so effectively it's very hard to tell the difference. I think it would be harder to fake one's interactions with the community, one's long-term commitments to working with and improving the lives of the people around you. So I think potentially the Internet of Communities and the data stores that underpin it could be a basis for online trust. These ideas can become part of bigger things. This comes back to the way in which governments, large organisations, and in particular organisations like the UN can create a framework for something like the Supercommunities model. The Future Generations Bill in 2015 in Wales is now leading to an effort to create something similar in the UK as a whole. That may or may not succeed, but there are similar efforts in other countries across the world. And the person that proposed the bill in Wales, Jane Davidson, writes in her book about a vision for how future generations work. Long-term thinking could be made practical and immediate for people, and that's to think of it in terms of a mosaic of communities that use local resources to meet their needs, where the economy is founded on social enterprises. This is very similar to the Supercommunities model that I'm setting out here. And I think it opens up a way to measure the effectiveness of future generations' work. A lot of future generations legislation is couched in rather vague, woolly terms. I think we could sharpen that by looking at the kinds of data that would be captured under a Supercommunities model. So that's data about community capitals, data about community assets, and data about how one is transformed into the other, how assets are maintained, and data about how the assets are being used for wellness. So how do you feel personally on hearing all this? Does it make you wonder about some of the communities you belong to? Do you feel that some of those missing links that I mentioned, the collaboration missing link, the holistic view of wellness, and you see down here the wellness wheel I mentioned earlier, safety, transport, learning, work, substance abuse issues, eating, activity, meeting people. These are all parts of a physical and mental health vision that go beyond traditional health and social care. Do you feel perhaps that is also not entirely catered for by the communities you belong to? Do you wish you could do more about that? What about the finance model? Do you feel that financing is effective for community initiatives and ventures in communities you're aware of? And when I say communities, I'm not just talking about places. I think the Supercommunities model is particularly applicable to places, to towns, parts of cities, regions, but it's also applicable to communities of experience. So a good example is people who have recently migrated. I gave the example of the Jewish community before. But there are also communities of people, for example, that have just left military service, and that's a community notorious for failing its members. There are communities of disability. There are wider communities of language or culture that can adopt the Supercommunities model to support their members. So perhaps bear in mind as we move to the Q&A section of this meeting, are there ways in which you would like to do more, in which you'd like to feel more connected, in which do you think the people around you could do more? And do you see perhaps how some of the things talked about today could relate to that? So just going to conclude by saying a little bit about what's going to happen next in my aim for this work. So one of the people on this call, Fritz Bussemark, and I are working together to build an international initiative based around the Supercommunities model and the underpinning technology. As part of this, I collect examples of inspirational social trading that we hope will be useful for other people as templates. So if you have such examples, do share them with me. I try and publish one a day to give myself a drumbeat on a page called socialechoes.info. There will be follow-on books to Supercommunities. There'll be a workbook. There'll be a book about the technology side. There'll be a book about the case studies that we're going to develop. And we're also reaching out to communities across the world to see whether they are, who and how would be interested in implementing the Supercommunities approach. And if you want to do it, it's very simple because you just work through those sources of data I mentioned in the Future Gen slide. So I'm going to stop talking, hand over to Lou for the Q&A. I think, Lou, we've got some questions in the chat, so perhaps you'd like to point out particular questions and see if people would like to read them out, or should we just work from the chat?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, Keith. That was really interesting. A lot to take in for everyone. But please do keep adding questions to the chat, and put a kind of virtual Zoom hand up if you want to add anything. And the first one that came up was from Mitchell, and he's asked if slide 7 could be circular, like a feedback loop. I don't know if you want to go back to slide 7.
I'm going to have to remind myself what slide 7 was.
This one.
Right, yes. So, well, that's a good question, Mitchell, because visual communication is not my speciality. I've tried to devise a simple graphic that captures what the supercommunity model is, but I'm aware that it's got deficiencies here, because in particular there should be feedback loops between capitals and assets, and that's not clearly shown. So that may be, and that's in fact what you say that, don't you? Community assets might feed into the capital. Like, that's exactly a weakness of this particular depiction. The reason I chose to draw it like this is because the virtuous loop on the left, which just focuses on assets, is something that people can immediately relate to. They can see how the projects they do to build the assets then feed into wellness. And then as people become more holistically well, as they become more self-activated and feel more empowered in their own lives, often part of that activation leads them to getting involved with those projects to improve the assets. And in fact, there's quite a lot of research on how volunteering has a major impact on wellness. And in fact, the greatest impact that volunteering has is on the volunteers. There's some research done by a group called Pro Bono Economics about 10 years ago, which is an organisation of economists involving the chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Harding, that did some financial breakdowns of what the benefits of volunteering are. And they found that if you analyse the output in those terms, in terms of financial benefit, then volunteers actually benefit more than the people who they are supporting through their volunteering. So that's partly why I show that virtuous loop on the left, but you're quite right that capital should be in there somewhere. Just haven't quite worked out how to get them in.
Thanks, Keith. Hopefully that was useful. The next question comes from, sorry, I don't know the first name, but S. Fama Devan, saying thank you. But also, could you share a specific example of a community data store within Internet Communities to bring the concept of to life?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples which I found quite startling. When I first started building what are called digital hubs for communities, the 3 hubs that I built to start with were one for my local town of Frome, population 27,000, and then 2 more for 2 districts in Birmingham, 2 of the parliamentary wards in Birmingham, Edgbaston and Ladywood. And what we found was that in Frome we had about 400 community assets, and using every data source we could find for Birmingham, this was in 2016, there were about the same number for the whole of Birmingham, population 1 million. So that was startling and illuminating. It showed that areas like Frome, which Frome is not hugely wealthy, is quite diverse, and it has quite a mixed range of demographics, let's put it that way. But what it does have is a lot of people who are very socially active, and so there are lots of charities, there are lots of social enterprises, lots of community groups, and we had probably more support for the community than we really needed in the town, although it's made it a great place to live. But by contrast, in Birmingham, we only found about the same amount of community assets that we had in this small town. So the areas that really need the community assets are often the areas that have least of them, and that's a big part of the problem. And that's why data is so important, because data throws that into sharp relief. And I think it's very important as well to understand the difference between static and dynamic data. A lot of communities of all sizes, towns, villages, cities, regions, do what people often call community asset mapping. And that can mean different things. It might mean creating a real map, like a picture that people draw assets onto. It can mean creating a website that has a list of community organisations on it. Or it can mean trying to make something more interactive that's more community owned, as we were doing with the digital hubs. And part of the reason for creating these hubs, in which each community organisation could update its own data, and in fact needed to update its own data in order to share the services it was offering, was that being up to date is really, really important. If you have a list of community groups and it shows a certain event as being open 7 o'clock every Thursday, and then someone turns up on a dark winter's night at 7 o'clock and just finds a locked scout hut, that's not going to be a good experience for them, and it will probably also turn them off from getting more involved with other community groups. So you need to avoid that, and the only way to avoid that is to have a dynamic source of data, and that's what the digital hubs were, and that's what shows you what is really happening in your community. So what I'm trying to say is two things. That one, data is important, but also it needs to be alive and it needs to be owned by the community, and they need to see that ownership as actually a way of reaching people. Otherwise they won't keep it up to date, or there won't be a way for them to keep it up to date, in which case the data is actually misleading and unhelpful. Does that answer your question? I don't know if that's really talking to the particular question you asked or not.
Thanks, Keith. Sorry, again, I don't know the first name. Is Fama Devon still with us? And do you want to come back? Okay. Well, thanks, Keith. That was a great answer. I'll just move on to a few more. We're getting quite a few in the chat here, so I'll keep it moving. Patricia asks, do you feel that mapping communities and the way they work will inherently undermine them?
I don't really understand why Patricia thinks they might. Patricia, could you explain a little bit more about that? I think you probably have something in mind that you're concerned about, but I don't see what it is.
If you want to come off mute, Patricia.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, great,
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, it's just in the fact that if you're going to try and pinpoint some of the critical factors that make communities work, by doing that, is it going to undermine the fact that the way they work, like you mentioned at the beginning, you know, some people sort of don't want it all written down, don't want it mapped out, don't want it sort of procedurized or made into process. So is some of the magic there because we don't know how it works, it just does?
So, okay, now I understand what you're getting at, and there's a number of interesting things about that. So, well, let's talk about a couple of them. One is that volunteering is different from being paid. If you start to reward people financially, directly financially, for the volunteering work they do, what you're effectively doing is making them very low paid and quite poorly treated public servants. A number of ways in which people start to feel used and abused if they go from contributing their time on a voluntary basis and doing something they really believe in to being rewarded in a very minor way for it. And there's probably more in that than we've really got time to unpack now, but that is one important issue about what you said. Another thing is that communities exist on what can be quite fragile networks of relationships, and often those networks are maintained by key players whose position is vital. And sometimes those key players wish to maintain that position for their own personal reasons, and that may or may not be good for them. I actually don't think it is that good for them in a real way. I think it's quite stressful for them, but it's not good for the community because it creates bottlenecks, and it means things can't get done in a free-flowing, efficient manner. That's another thing. And then there are what you might think of as informal feedback loops, by which some organisations will help each other out in return for favours in kind, if you like. There are, I think saying it's like scratch my back and I'll scratch yours makes it sound grasping in a way. It isn't. I think those relationships are often quite natural and quite thoughtful and quite kind in their origination. But people worry that if they write them down, they will cease to exist, that those kind of feedback loops will just kind of won't withstand the pressure of being documented. Now, I don't think that to be true. I think the opposite is true. I think if you acknowledge the services that people provide for each other, the ways in which they think about each other and care about each other, it not only helps those feedback loops to become more robust, but it also recognises what people are doing in an unsung way all the time. Patricia, would you like, there's so much in your question that I almost don't want to say too much in case I'm going off on a different tack to what you were thinking about. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about, or was there something else?
Yes, it's the intangible feedback loops, like you say, for the fact that people are doing it for different reasons. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks both. Next up, we're getting quite a few, so maybe I'll try and get in as many as I can, of course. So Mary asked Keith, how is Supercommunities different from other existing models? For example, the community wealth building model.
So those models, Cleveland and Preston, are seminal. I talk about them a lot in the book. They're demonstrating the possibility of something, if you like. I think there's still quite a long way to go with those models, and everyone involved in them will acknowledge that. They will acknowledge how hard it has been to make those models work, how many years it has taken, and how they're still on a long path. And I think part of the reason it's been hard is because they've been creating this stuff from scratch, that they've been working out as they go along, and they haven't been able to draw on certain things like, for example, simple structured ways to collaborate. I think they've had to approach wellness issues piecemeal rather than holistically, addressing them as they can, as best they can. And I think they could have possibly done more had they had a holistic approach. And I also think they've had to rely on very large injections of funding from certain anchor institutions, as they call them. Now, none of these things is in any way meant as a criticism of the work done in those places. And they are kind of beacons in the world of progressive economic thinking about how you can do things differently. But I suppose what I'm saying is that it's possible to make it easier than that. It's possible to have a shorter, less stressful journey that doesn't necessarily rely on such committed, large-scale financial support from anchor institutions. That's always going to be helpful, but you can get started on a small scale without that. And I think my small town of Frome shows that you can do a lot without those large injections of capital. And you see that also in other places, such as this town in Germany that's become ecologically self-sufficient with a net zero carbon footprint. That town's only got 15,000 people. It's much smaller than Cleveland or Preston. So there are opportunities to take the best of those models and scale them up, scale them out, and scale them down, I think, by using these structured approaches. Mary, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I think, I think they're all interrelated, aren't they? And the components that need to be taken from one to build the other. And I feel, you suggested that it's a long journey for those organisations, but it feels to me like it could also be quite a long journey for the supercommunities model as well. So to bring, if you're trying to create a really holistic model, it's always going to be quite a long journey. But thank you.
Yes, I think you're right. It's going to be years. It's just the Cleveland and Preston model has been decades, really. They've been well over 10 years. And I would like to think you could do it. You could get far and fast in, say, 5 years rather than 15. That's the kind of difference I'm talking about. Not that you could do it in weeks or months. That would be unrealistic and ridiculous.
Thanks, Keith. I'll move on to a question from David, which is, do supercommunities replace the current economy or layer on top of it? So he goes on to say, I'm thinking of the section in debt that talks about the return to credit over currency in the Middle Ages. And could supercommunities do the same to free the majority from the financialisation of society?
Well, I should say that I'm not advocating any kind of replacement of currency or taxation or any of those basic mechanisms by which society operates. But I think it's important to acknowledge that currency does not flow around our society in an effective way at the moment. In fact, we're moving to a world where increasingly governments don't know where currency is flowing at all. Large chunks of the world's economy are vanishing into black holes, which are untaxable. And that is an argument for reshaping financial flows. I don't personally feel it's an argument for, say, cryptocurrency. I think cryptocurrency is destabilizing. And I'm not advocating such an alternative. I'm also not advocating things like replacement of fiat currencies with tokens at a local level. But I am advocating new forms of simple, direct investment in social enterprise that can unlock some of the vast amounts of money in global capital markets. So global capital markets are something like $179 trillion in size at the moment. That's an almost unimaginable amount of money, and a small amount of it is currently invested in what you might think of as investments with impact, social impact, environmental, social governance investments. But a lot of that is greenwashing. A lot of that is really in name only, and where you have vehicles for investment that are intended to eliminate greenwashing, such as social impact bonds, the administration cost is huge. So someone in UNICEF, an old friend, told me that if they invest £50 million in a social impact bond, 25 million of that will go on administration. That says to me that there is a desire at those levels to reshape financial flows, but the mechanisms that exist at the moment are not adequate. So that's why I'm pushing for a stake it back model, a much simpler, direct way of investing in social enterprises, which is based on the statement by that social enterprise that if they meet a target, they will return the investment plus a certain amount. And along the way, they'll report their progress against that target as well as against other targets, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think a mechanism such as that, which has no intermediary, which shifts the risk onto the investor, which requires no administration or very low administration, can fundamentally reshape the world, the way the world's money flows. And in that sense, I am arguing for a change.
Thanks,
I'll come back on that, Keith.
Oh, yes.
Please do.
So there's a couple of things, and I agree with everything you said. The thing I was thinking more of was the sort of not the removal of fiat currency, but my understanding was there was a process of netting off local flows. So people lived on credit locally, and then periodically there would be a reckoning when people used the fiat currency to settle the differences between the inflows and outflows within their local community. So I was thinking more on that model. And I absolutely agree that the freeing up of, I'm like most people, I'm probably sitting on, a relatively large pension fund, which I have very little control over. I would much prefer having mechanisms to invest in local assets for a reasonable return, rather than putting it into a financial system that I neither trust nor control.
Yeah, indeed. The netting off mechanism you speak of, David, I don't know enough about that to comment on it, but I guess we probably haven't got time in this meeting to talk about. I should say to everybody, we're clearly not going to get through all the questions, but please do reach out to me by my website. Just type Supercommunities into Google and you'll get to my website. And do feel free to contact me. We're very much engaging with people in the member. I'll be pleased to hear your questions, to answer them in the best of my ability. And but anyway, for now, let's carry on, Lou, shall we, and see if we've got time for perhaps one more.
Yeah, sure. I was going to bring Jane Durney in if she's still with us, just to kind of pose a couple of, well, maybe just one of her questions, just to finish us off.
Hi. I asked 3 questions in the chat. How does the Supercommunities model fit with the need to live within a fair share of the Earth's resources and to achieve net zero carbon? So I know you refer to Sustainable Development Goals, but is there a role for targets within this? And I think just my other question was simply totally different, but many of our local community groups have absolutely no online presence. I live in Bruton, so just down the road from you in Freeman. I founded One Planet Bruton. But how would those groups that have no online presence, don't use Facebook or anything else, how would they fit, but are very active, how would they fit into the Supercommunities model? So targets and
targets
no online presence.
Okay, so targets. Well, every community, I think, needs to have realistic targets, and I think there's a level of economic inequality which generates climate inequality. Some communities may just find it a lot easier than others. It may be much more easily within their reach to achieve net zero. So we have to recognise that and not penalise communities which have to put certain aspects of wellness before that, in the short term at any rate. I think we can use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as very powerful, very robust metrics for all sorts of things, not just that. There's also, I showed you my own metrics that I would recommend for future generations, which kind of play into that space as being a way that any community can use to understand its progress along the Supercommunities path. Your other question about digital presence, I don't think you can stay offline these days. I don't think it's realistic, but a lot of people stay offline because of fear, because they think they don't want to become part of some kind of big tech machine harvesting their data for commercial purposes. So we have to remove that fear, both by providing free and easily usable platforms, and by reassuring people that these platforms are not run by big tech, they're owned by communities, their purposes are virtuous and social, and I think that would do a lot to reassure community groups that they should get online, they can achieve their purposes better by doing so, and there is help available at a local level for doing that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Keith, and everyone, of course. I will draw us to a close now, but we do hope that we might do some kind of follow-up event, and we'll make sure we do keep people up to date. And Keith, people have asked if you will share the slides. Are you happy to do that after the event?
Well, the slides are a work in progress, and they're changing daily, but everything in these slides is on my website, and it's either on my Supercommunities website or in my personal website, which has my blog. Well, the images you're seeing are taken from that blog. So it's all there. And if you want more detail, of course, there's my book. So available from Amazon or any good bookstore.
Well, thank you very much, Keith, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the event, and we look forward to seeing you at a future one. So thank you, and good day, good evening, good night, wherever
Thanks,
you may
everybody.
be. Thanks very much.